History and culture. Meet Mexico's forgotten panda. She's the last of her kind. Her name is Sin Sin, and she's one of the only three pandas in the world not owned by China. But these may be the final days of Mexico's half-century panda love affair. In 2018, 1 year after the moving to Mexico City from his native Venezuela, photographer Alejandro Segarra was visiting the Chapultepec Zoo. As he strolled through the vast 42-acre expanse of parks and wildlife exhibits, he was shocked to discover a lush panda exclosure, a panda in Mexico City. The encounter led him down a rabbit hole to 1970s Mexico, when the country had effectively recognized China's authority over Taiwan at the United Nations. Soon, other Latin American countries followed suit, and China gifted two giant pandas, Pepe and Ying Ying, to the Mexican zoo. In 1975, their arrival sparked a panda fever, pop songs, cartoons, and commemorative coins celebrating the pandas embedded into the country's cultural fabric. Today, Sin Sin, the granddaughter of the two gifted pandas, is the last of her kind in Latin America, and one of the only three in the world not owned by China. At 33 years old, she's 5 years from matching the record lifespan of a panda in captivity. But as of now, there's no plan to replace her. These may be the final days of Mexico half-century panda love affair. This is a forgotten panda, said Segarra, while Mexico City residents still visit the zoo's biggest star. The past decades have transformed the city into a hub of attractions and entertainment. Major concerts, Formula One car races, even the World Cup will be played there in 2026. Amid this abundance of distraction, Sin Sin has faded to the background. Starting in the late 1950s, China gifted giant pandas to countries as a sign of friendship and diplomatic alliance. China has been using pandas in international relations possibly as far back as the 7th century. When Empress Gu Zhenchen sent two bears, likely pandas, to Japan, that tradition ended in 1984, when China changed its protocols and began renting the pandas on 10-year leases. Today, zoos pay fees of up to $1 million a year per panda pair, and any foreign-born offspring are considered Chinese property and must be returned. Breeding pandas is difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. Very few are born in captivity outside China. Veterinarians at the Chapultepec Zoo in Mexico City were the first to successfully do so. In August 1980, the baby was named Sang Li, meaning success. At the time, there were an estimated 250 pandas in the wild and 50 in captivity. Today, there are approximately 500 in zoos and reserves, and around 1,800 in the wild. In the past 40 years, 8 giant pandas were born in Mexico, and 5 lived to adulthood. The panda's placement across the globe traces decades of Chinese political interest. In 2008, 2 giant pandas were gifted to Taiwan in a rare moment of warming relation. Like in Mexico, the offspring of those pandas are not the property of the Chinese government, though Taiwan's independence is contested by China. To critics, China's strategy of pandas diplomacy, gifting and loaning to the bears to friendly countries, is a tactic to soften the superpower global image. To supporters, the exchanges are hailed as a model of international cooperation that benefits a vulnerable species. A geopolitical relationship between two countries links with a lonely panda in Mexico City that no one remembers, said Segarra. It's so unique. At the Chapultepec Zoo, it took Segarra more than 20 visits over 6 months to complete a photography project on Sin. The last Mexico's 11 pandas. Pandas sleep up to 12 hours a day and spend much of the rest sedentary, snacking on bamboo and lodging. In the meantime, he got to know Sin Poses, the veterinarian Myram Noguera, who has spent the past decade tending to her and other zoo animals, and the panda's caregiver, who has spent nearly every day of the past 20 years cleaning her habitat, preparing her bamboo, and ensuring her safety. Once, he looked after 3 pandas. Now, he watches only Sin. Next ad. How about here? Animals. What bacteria and fungi lurk in your city? Bees may have the answer. Although we try not to think about it, our cities are teeming with trillions upon trillions of bacteria, fungi, and viruses. Knowing which one are afoot can tell researchers a lot about the health of the plants, animals, and human in the area, but collecting microorganisms on a city-wide scale is quite difficult and expensive. Now, scientists have found a way to sample entire cities using honeybees. In a new study published March 30 in the journal Environmental Microbiome, scientists demonstrated how sampling the debris at the bottom of honeybee hives can provide scientists with a snapshot of the microbial landscape of urban environment. In the paper, scientists analyzed DNA in debris from rooftop and backyard honeybee hives in New York City, Sydney, Melbourne, Venice, and Tokyo, and found that each location had a unique genetic signature. Some samples even contain a pathogen known to cause disease in humans. Although more research is needed to know if honeybees can be used to effectively detect diseases in cities, the study's authors said the handy little honey producers have the potential to make citywide microorganism monitoring much easier. Swapping swabs for swarms. It's important to be able to characterize the microbiomes of the cities that we live in, said Elizabeth Haneff, an assistant professor at New York University, who studies how living beings interact with their environment. More than half of the world's population live in cities. Yet, the microbial landscape of these environments remains poorly understood. What scientists do know is that the microbial city slickers we interact with can greatly impact on their health. In 2010, honeybees in Red Hook, Brooklyn, raided a nearby maraschino cherry factory, producing bright red syrup, which garnered a lot of press. This inspired Haneff and her colleague to launch a pilot study to examine what other substances in New York honeybees were bringing back to their hives. It struck the researchers that this might be an easier way to sample microbes than swabbing for organisms on subway poles, sidewalks, and the like. The scientists sampled honeybee, dead bees, and debris from 3 hives in New York City and found a diverse array of genetic data, most of which came from hive debris. After that, the researcher collected hive debris from beekeepers in Australia, Italy, and Japan, each of which has its own local flair. The hive debris from Venice was dominated by fungi commonly found in rotting wood, which is abundant in the waterlogged city. In Tokyo, samples of hive debris were loaded with, this word is kind of difficult, a strain of yeast used in soy sauce fermentation. Additionally, DNA from the pathogen Rhizophilus, which caused a typhus-like febrile disease in humans, sometimes called cat scratch fever, was found in some of these samples from Tokyo. They also uncovered some noteworthy bacteria inside the Brooklyn hives, including a species known to degrade pollinated, also known as PCBs, and another previously found in high-altitude Andean lakes that's tolerant to extreme conditions. Unsurprisingly, the researcher also found lots of microorganisms associated with bees during their study. They found microorganisms known to benefit bees as well, which are both bee pathogens that cause disease in bees. The authors said their findings indicate that sampling hive debris can not only provide insight into the health of the bee's environment, but also the bees themselves. Flying Swiffers. Though they're daily foraging, honeybees sample the soil, water, air, and everything in between. Lewis Bartlett, a research scientist at the University of Georgia, who studies honeybees and the infections of disease that impact them. You can think of them as little flying Swiffer sheets. Bartlett says, bees are covered in little hairs that collect pollen, but those hairs also catch particulates that exist in urban areas, such as pollutants, danger from animals and insects, that sort of thing. And then they go home and they dust themselves off so that they are nice and clean. While the pollen they collected gets put to good use, everything else ends up in debris pile beneath the hive. Sampling the debris created by honeybees in urban areas is a really interesting way to go about sampling the environment, said Bartlett. He believes that the method has merit not just because honeybees are excellent samplers, but also because beekeepers tend to be really enthusiastic about getting on board with scientific research. Bees for a better tomorrow. The community of microbes in an area depends on many things, such as the landscape and degree of development. Urbanization represents one of the most transformational landscape processes across the globe, said Christopher Skell, an urban ecologist at the University of Washington, Tacoma, who wasn't involved in the paper. Understanding how the microbial landscape is altered by urbanization, he says, is important for all creatures and for human health. There's a growing body of literature that shows the exposure to diverse microbiomes is a key component for positive health outcomes. Hanav says, being able to determine the diversity of the microbial committees of different neighborhoods seem really important from a city planning perspective, especially with respect to environmental justice, she says. While it remains to be seen if honeybees will one day help scientists detect diseases or city planners make cities more equitable, Hanaf's study has demonstrated the insect's immense promise as little scientific samplers. Finish the second article. Let's go to the next one. T-Rex. Science. T-Rex had lips, appending its enduring pop culture image. Whether carnivorous dinosaurs had lips had long been the stuff of paleo debate. A new study finds evidence that flesh covered the predator's teeth. The fearsome jaws of Tyrannosaurus are famous. In museums halls, paleo art, and even feature films such as Jurassic Park. The Cretaceous carnivore has traditionally been depicted with banana-sized fangs and a sinister grin, but paleontologists have now discovered that the living animal did not have a sharp-toothed smirk. T-Rex, as well as many other carnivorous dinosaurs, had lips. Reported today in Science, a multi-institution team of paleontologists proposed that carnivorous dinosaurs like T-Rex and Allosaurus had fleshy lips covering their teeth, much as modern-day lizards do. The hypothesis will likely after both the public image of dinosaurs as well as how paleontologists study the ways these terrible lizards fed. The new research got its start as discussion between co-authors Thomas Cullen, Kirsten Brick, and Derek Larson. While all three were graduate students at the University of Toronto, each had developed different expertise on dinosaurs and their anatomy, which began to meld together into taggable evidence for how dinosaurs like T-Rex would have looked. Whether or not dinosaurs had lips has been a matter of debate among dinosaur fans and some experts for years. The arguments have often centered less impressive and frightening to their adoring fans than the traditional to the rendition, and what evidence might justify such a change. The new study finally offers some tangible evidence to resolve the issue. Moving beyond aesthetics to the biology of the extinct animals, there's a lot of interpretation in paleo art. It's nice to offer some scientific data to back it up, says Brick, now a paleontologist at the University of Manitoba. Giving dinosaurs some lip. To determine whether dinosaurs like T-Rex had exceptionally long teeth, Cullen, now at Auburn University, Brick and colleague examined the anatomy of living lizards and crocodiles. The microscopic structure of dinosaur teeth and how tooth size compares with skull dimensions in species. From T-Rex, smaller carnivores such as Velociraptor and Coleophysics. The star specimen, however, was the T-Rex nicknamed Sue, the largest and most complete representative of the story species, and on display at Chicago's Field Museum. Despite Sue seeming to have extra long chompers, the paleontologists found its teeth had the same relationship to skull size as seen in today's miniature lizard, and therefore wouldn't require any extraordinary lips to cover. A critical part of the research was finding modern analogs. Today's birds, a descendant of dinosaurs, lack teeth, and crocodiles are specialized reptiles that live in the water. Even though they're not as closely related, however, dinosaurs or reptiles such as miniature lizards are more useful in their relatedness to dinosaur anatomy. This study is a great piece of paleontological forensic detective work, says University of Edinburgh paleontologist Steve Brusette, who was not involved in the new research. The overall analysis suggested T-Rex and similar dinosaurs did not have extra long teeth for their size. A set of lips could have easily covered their teeth. More telling is that the enamel of dinosaur teeth is relatively thin and would have been prone to drying out if consistently exposed to the air. Lips would have kept their teeth wet and functional, something that crocodiles don't have to worry about as aquatic animals. Cullen and colleague make an excellent case for the presence of extra extra oral tissue in non-avian theropods, said University of Pennsylvania paleontologist Ali Nabafida, who was not involved in the new study. Lips may not be unique to theropods either. Recent studies on various herbivorous dinosaurs, such as long-necked sauropods and horned ceratocids, have found evidence of gum, cheeks, and other soft tissues covering their teeth. And for those who might suggest that change makes dinosaurs less impressive, Cullen notes that having lips or even feathers has no real bearing or something being scary or fearsome. Just look at birds of prey or many mammalian carnivores. Paleontologists sink their teeth in, adding lips to T-Rex and other dinosaurs creatures, a fuller image of their anatomy and how interacted with their environment. The scientist said, "I'm very interested in the role soft tissue play when interpreting tooth pathologies." Briggs says, as gum, lips, and other tissue could experience much of the same injuries and diseases that affect living animals. Nabavida adds that lip likely made T-Rex more effective predator. For one, reptiles don't have the lip muscle that mammals do, so a T-Rex can sneer, or do an Elvis Presley impression for that matter. The lips, Nabavida notes, were to protect the teeth from abrasion and to keep them wet. Think of their lips as akin to the sheath of a knife, Brazood adds, something that helped maintain the murder weapons and ensure they were as deadly as possible. Move on to our fourth article. History Magazine. These two ancient empires shaped Passover. The holiday celebrates the Israelites' liberation from Egyptian slavery, but it continued evolving after the Neo-Babylonians conquered Jerusalem in 587 BC. Every spring, Jews the world over gathered to mark Passover, Judaism, ancient celebration of divine deliverance, as told in the book of Exodus. Moses seek freedom for enslaved Hebrews in Egypt, but Pharaoh refuses to let them go. Unleashing this wrath, God set 10 plagues upon Egypt, each one worse than the next. The final one is most terrible of all. God will kill the firstborn son of each family in Egypt. The Israelites will be spared if they follow God's instruction. They must slaughter in a lamb without blaming a year-old male, and smear the blood on the doorposts and lintels of their home. Then God instructs them. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. This is how you shall eat. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Hebrews shall repeat this ritual in thanksgiving to God for generation to come. Moses tells them and explains the guidelines for doing so. They will celebrate from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day of Nisan, the first month in the Hebrew calendar, which usually falls in late March and early April. A storied meal. Passover continues to be celebrated as a great spring festival of Judaism. In many parts of the world, it lasts for 7 days, while in Israel, it is celebrated for 8. It is a joyous time when families gather for a seder, a meal rich with ancient ritual, to remember their ancestor deliverance. The feast, holds meaning for Christians too. All four gospel writers recount how the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth takes place on or around the celebration of Passover in Jerusalem. Much of the core symbolism of Passover, enacted year after year, can be found in the Seder. Modern Passover celebration followed the rules set out in Exodus, but the ritual has absorbed many changes over the centuries, reflecting the upheavals and impacts of history. Tradition holds that Moses lived in the 13th century BC, the period in which Pharaoh, such as Ramses II, ruled ancient Egypt. Some biblical historians believe that the ritual outlined by Moses predate this time, going back to the dawn of Jewish history. Slaughtering spring lambs and eating unleavened bread may have once been separate spring festival that were later incorporated into the story of the Exodus. Biblical scholars broadly agree that the oldest material in the book of Exodus is from about the 9th century BC, and that it took its current from its 5th century BC. In the Hebrew Bible, the Israelites are delivered out of slavery and will eventually settle in Canaan, the so-called Promised Land. The city of Jerusalem will become their capital, ruled by Kings David and Solomon, who built a grand temple there. The Israelites' memory of their time in Egypt is never far away, as the celebration of Passover continues over the centuries. In a foreign land, another exile occurring some 8 centuries after the time of Moses would further shape Judaism and Passover. At this time, the Promised Land had split into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Geopolitical Judah, centered on its hilltop capital, Jerusalem, was sandwiched between 2 great regional powers, Egypt and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In 587 BC, the Neo-Babylonian king set siege to Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and made Judah a province of his empire. Swaths of the population of Judah were forcibly deported to Babylon. Many scholars use this deportation to mark the creation of the Jewish diaspora, large communities of Jews living outside Jerusalem. Several biblical books, including Jeremiah, Kings, Chronicles, and Ezra, document the event of the exile. Perhaps the most famous passage is the beautiful Psalms 137, which laments, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when remembered Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song when in a foreign land?" During their captivity in Babylon, the Jewish exile reflected deeply on what had befallen them. On their suffering and their covenant with God, scholars and scribes continue to write, forming the foundation of several books of the Old Testament, as well as solidifying the Torah. The 5 first books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These books certainly have roots that predate the Babylonian period, but many biblical historians concur that a dynamic process of scholarship and national renewal inspired by the period in Babylon brought together the composition of the books of Moses as they are known now. Nearly 50 years later, in 540 BC, Babylon and the Neo-Babylonian reign fell to the Persian conqueror Cyrus the Great, who allowed the exiled Jews to return to Judah. In the book of Isaiah 44:28, the prophet has God say of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, You shall be built into the temple